Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by someone I think who provides a very unique perspective and expertise related to, a topic I saw Austin Brockie, so a previous guest of the podcast, bring up, which was, and I don't remember the exact post or the specifics, but he talked a bit about visualization. Dr. Giacobbi, the guest on today's podcast, would you call yourself an expert on guided imagery?
Most certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Dr. Giacobbi is an expert on guided imagery. He's also on my committee, the committee of for my degree. And I thought, what better way to introduce the topic and explore it, by bringing on one of the foremost experts on the topic. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I didn't know your podcast was philosophical weightlifting, which is appropriate because of how we met in a bar. And we got eventually to the point where I forwarded you two articles, one on the pragmatic research philosophy for sport and exercise psychology that I published in 2005.
Yeah.
So we got talking about that, but I guess I never didn't know the podcast was philosophical weightlifting.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Totally appropriate.
No, and I think we share that interest. In the article that you shared with me, I can link that in the description of the podcast itself. And I think, where all of this, when you think about philosophy, you think about, any field that relates to human behavior or function, be it physical training, physical fitness, thinking about meaning and purpose of life, it does come down to this like pragmatic, impact-oriented mindset of what does this actually do for me? People can complain about philosophy as being like dry and really jargon and heavy on things kind of unrelated and unnecessary. So I think that paper you sent me was a great kind of ode to, how do we make a meaningful difference or change? How do we distill things down?
Problem solving.
Yeah.
You're using a practical approach. And so, that was one of my favorite papers to write. It was actually part of my qualifying exam as a PhD student where that was inspired. So I'll just talk a little bit about my background, if that's okay.
Oh, that's perfect. Great segue.
Yeah. So I grew up in upstate New York, a small town called Camillus, right outside of Syracuse, and West Genesee graduate, 1982, lacrosse powerhouse, still to this day. A lot of my peers ended up playing lacrosse for Syracuse, Johns Hopkins, other great programs and around the country. So I eventually got my associate's degree in the humanities. I was simultaneously working a lot of this time with children as a preschool teacher in a Head Start program, and eventually at a residential facility for youth, working with youth or wards of the state. And so that influenced me a lot. I got my degree in psychology, eventually in sports studies, and then also education with an emphasis in sports psychology from the University of Tennessee in 2000 is when I graduated. Now, throughout all that, I'm a golfer, okay? And not currently. I have other hobbies that we're probably not going to go there.
Sure, yeah.
But I grew up playing golf on Westvale Golf Club up in Camillus. I grew up there, eventually won the county championship at that course.
That's great.
I worked there. I gave golf lessons there for several years before going back to graduate school. So a lot of my experiences were really from Jack Nicklaus, another famous Ohioan.
Yeah.
Aside from Josh.
Yes.
Jack Nicklaus, pretty well known in golf circles. He published a series in Golf Digest in the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of he talked about guided imagery, visualizing a golf shot from start to finish. And he used to describe it as a movie reel that he could play backwards and forwards.
Wow.
So he can control that in his mind. So I was very influenced by Jack Nicklaus as a kid and that belief that you can control your images the way you think in your mind. So aside from that, my expertise, and I'll ask Josh if you have any questions, but my expertise is in behavior change, human behavior change, applications of guided imagery for health and performance, which is closely related to mindfulness. I've published about 86 publications, and I'm a fellow in the Society of Behavioral Medicine as well. So in addition, I'm a professor in sports sciences. Yeah. So that's me.
Yeah, no, that was incredibly thorough. And I think really relates to the underlying theme of the podcast and the overlying theme, which is having a focus or concentration on kind of the thoughtful pursuits of health and performance and like psychological well-being. I think to distill the podcast down, I really think those are kind of the main ideas. And you fit right in. And one of our first conversations related to guided imagery and smoking cessation, which I didn't think there was a connection there. And then you kind of related the benefits and, what's something that feels as simple as guided imagery. I'm sure it's work and time, but it's non-invasive really. So I found that kind of like that intervention really fascinating. So maybe you can kind of expand on your background and how you started getting into lines of research and how those opened you up to, the impact that guided imagery can have on someone's health.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should just also back up the smoking cessation trial that you mentioned. We're in our 4th year of funding, but for this particular grant, and I've had 2 others with Dr. Judith Gordon, who just retired from the University of Arizona. She's an expert in smoking cessation. So I've been a co-investigator on 3 NIH grants with her, really since I've arrived at WVU. And I've also had funding from the National Athletic Trainers Association, indirectly a foundation called Global Impact, which was created by Facebook. So I had funding recently from Facebook Meta and other organizations going way back. But moving into the guided imagery piece, I think that is a great question, and it highlights kind of how we control ourselves. And what I mean by that is everything. And I use the ABCs of human experiences: affect, behavior, and cognition. And a central piece of what I do, and central piece is that we can control the way we think, feel, and act, as opposed to being something predetermined or some set of physical events that dictate what we do in the environment, like reinforcements, like eating, like survival. I think we can control the way we think, feel, and act. That's a central belief in my approach. And it's also one of the oldest debates in human history.
Yeah, it is.
Going back to the ancient Greeks, as far as we know. Could be further, but you can see parallels with this in religious and spiritual studies, in the Bible. Certainly, you can see how this debate gets played out at a broad level. So that's where I approach it. And yeah, I'll just stop there. I can go into the details of those trials. I can talk to you about how it's applied in a smoking trial, what that actually looks like, and maybe even start with this. Let's just define what I mean.
And that's exactly where I was going to head with this. What do we even mean when we talk about it?
So imagery or visualization is a basic human function for most people, okay? We can imagine our world. We can imagine our past, right? We can imagine images, feelings, and experiences right here between our eyes, okay? Whenever we want. Mm-hmm. That's a part of who we are. So those are images for most of us. Now, we also talked before your class on, what night was that? Wednesday night? Yeah, it was
Thursday.
Thursday,
yep.
Okay. We talked before and about really a condition known as aphantasia, which means that these are people who cannot really have images, don't have images or the ability to imagine things the way I'm describing. And this is something that I just learned about in the last 10 years. But essentially what I'm talking about with guided imagery, you are guided or prompted, usually by an audio file, to imagine certain behaviors, like getting ready to exercise, or what it would be like to be smoke-free and not dependent upon nicotine products, okay? What would that be like in your life in terms of how you save money, how you feel about yourself, the smell of your clothing, your breath, your relationships, okay? And so in a guided imagery setup, like in the study with Judith Gordon, like what we've been doing, we develop or we co-develop scripts that turn into audio files. And they're usually about 3 or 4 minutes long, sometimes longer. And we instruct people to listen to them daily, at least once a day. And what we found essentially is we've had good success rates compared to a rigorously controlled condition, a cognitive behavioral condition. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of that right now because it's an ongoing study. We don't know the results. And really what enhances it, and I've been talking too long now, what enhances it is using your senses and emotions. So if you think back, like, where you were when you had your first kiss or when you had a child. Okay, something really striking. You think about all the emotions and senses of that event.
Yeah.
Like what you ate, what it tasted like, what, any emotions you experienced in that moment. And that can be done by a machine or a human. I can create those types of imagery prompts. And that's the health side.
Okay. So why would something like that be so effective or helpful? So like you could imagine doing that, in an alternative universe, you can imagine doing that and there being no effect or no change or no difference. So what is it about this idea of kind of like going inwards and having some sort of guided reflective time that would lead to improvements in, a behavior or change in a behavior that could impact your health decision making?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just to qualify, it's the research that I've done on this is real preliminary in a lot of senses, except for the tobacco trials. Those have been built up, and there's an evidentiary basis of that dates back 10 years or so. But I've done this with enhanced fitness with overweight and obese women, and I've done this as a peer mentoring approach with older adults, and now pregnancy. I've also established some early results in pregnancy. Now, what is it about it? It's not always effective, and it depends on your openness to this. And like I said earlier, those with aphantasia, I'm not even sure how to describe it because it's not a clinical category that I know of in terms of anything with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So I'm not sure, but apparently it has. We pulled up that link from the Mayo Clinic that described it. So there's a reputable source.
Yeah, it said like 2% to 4% of people are impacted by it. And it had this image of it was a cardinal, right? And it had like 5 different depictions of a cardinal. One was perfectly colorful. And then it was like a gradient that as you got to the bottom, you really couldn't make it out. So I think that, and it's kind of funny. You showed me that and mentioned it. And I've read some Oliver Sacks stuff. And all of his writings, or most of his writings that I've read, are case studies. He was a neurologist, and he would write about cases of people with neurological impairments and the way it impacted their lives and how they, like their lived experience. And that aphantasia, almost reminds me of like a chapter in an Oliver Sacks book.
Okay. I got to write the name down.
Yeah.
Because I'm becoming more interested in this now that I've discovered this, and it's probably underestimated. If we don't know much about it, the science, and they said it on the Mayo Clinic, the science is really not there to really support any really broad conclusions, especially the prevalence of that in the population. But there's an example of then folks with intellectual impairments, perhaps traumatic experiences. Sure. There are differences in how you handle that with folks with traumatic experiences too, how you would use this. And I would say only by a clinically trained person. But where was I going with that?
Well, I think if we, you mentioned guided imagery in like a health context with smoking cessation, and the podcast is targeted toward people who are focused on improving their own performance or someone else's. It's also focused, I think more importantly, to people who are focused on improving their health or someone else's.
So can we? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Can we talk about some direct health applications?
I think that'd be perfect. Be perfect.
Start with stress. Okay, we all know what it is. We all experience it. Stress, anxiety, depression. Okay. This is a clinical tool that's used in cognitive behavioral therapy to treat those conditions in one way, shape, or form, depending on the clinician. But again, you got to be open to it. And you also got to believe, can you control yourself? Okay. Can you control this? You could make an argument when someone has clinical depression, for instance, that they can't control the way they think and feel.
Yeah.
Okay. You could make that argument, especially in real severe cases.
Yeah.
Where medication is part of the therapy. This may not be appropriate in that sense. So for that population, but it is a good tool for risk reduction. And I'll use that phrase for helping you reduce the risks of any effects of chronic stress or chronic anxiety. And that's a clear application. You can use it for sleep, promote sleep at bedtime, or just general relaxation throughout the day. So that's one direct one. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's perfect. And I think all of those things are meaningful because they either directly impact, some measure, some measure of a proxy for health, which is like perceived stress. You could say that could be a proxy for health outcome, some health outcome. You could also say that by using guided imagery, you could impact a behavior that would then directly impact health. So if stress management would be more direct, but if we thought about, okay, this would help you get to the gym or help you engage in some sort of like physical activity behavior, that would then be a secondary effect. So when we think about guided imagery and the way you're describing, its impact, I guess what's the intervention, and then how does that end up playing out? So maybe you could almost not talk us through.
I was going to do that.
Oh,
I know where you're going with that.
Also do that, but what would that look like to help reduce stress? If someone said, Dr. Giacobbi is talking about the benefits of guided imagery, let me suss that out and figure it out for myself.
Okay. All right. So let me just go back to one randomized trial that I conducted while I was at the University of Florida, or not Florida, Arizona, two of my previous employers there. We did a randomized control trial where women who were trying to lose weight were randomized to either receiving guided imagery or not receiving guided imagery in a peer mentoring model for exercise. Okay, so they met on 6 occasions. I might have that wrong because this was published 10 years ago. But they met and they were given homework, daily homework. And so the purpose of the meetings were to check in about exercise goals. Everyone did that. The only difference between the two conditions was that the participants randomized to the guided imagery condition were given a script to read daily and to rate how vividly they saw this in their mind. So what we found at the end of that is that the participants who received that imagery training, and I'll give you an example of that in just a moment, had significantly greater increases in motivation to continue being active compared to those who didn't get the imagery. And I've shown that before. It's associated with motivation.
Okay.
If you use imagery a lot, you're motivated, you're thinking about your goals a lot, and it helps to build your confidence. So it makes sense. And I should also say it's the most widely used skill for performance enhancement, coaches, athletes, and sports psychologists.
Okay.
That should be out there.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a reason people use this technique.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, and I opened the podcast with the anecdote with Austin. Austin is one of for me, like the foremost trusted sources. And if he mentions something like this, that almost ignited my interest to the point of reaching out to you. And then you kind of helped support it by saying, it's foremost used tool to keep going. No, it's great support for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a starter point. Now let's also we're going back and forth between the health and the performance.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And that makes sense. I mean, we are holistic humans.
Yeah.
And that's, again, my affect behavior cognition approach. And I'll offer you another anecdote that, supports my reasoning here is that the Field Manual 22, Holistic Health and Fitness, published by the United States Army, it came out in 2020, but I'm not sure why they call it 22, but it outlines all of the physical, mental, spiritual, behavioral, and brain health importance and techniques for the soldier. Okay, so when the Army gets a hold of this kind of science, which they did, it's scientifically based, and does that and places that emphasis, and I want to emphasize the whole person there.
Yeah.
Spiritual fitness is, broadly speaking. And, they use imagery, they use standard practices in the sports psychology world,
Okay.
Imagery and self-talk.
Yeah.
And they place a big emphasis on physical fitness. Okay. That's part of my philosophy too.
Yeah.
So anyways, there's the anecdotal part of that. But then let's go a step further and say, let me show you what that might look like for stress reduction and motivation. And you can I'll just say the words and you can kind of go through it if you want. I usually I do this in the classroom a lot, and I instruct students to close their eyes, but it'd be kind of weird on a podcast.
Or if they're driving. I mean,
yeah.
You could try it, but not in
clarify that. Let me just clarify that right off the bat. Don't do this if you're driving.
Yeah. Pull over.
Yeah.
Find a safe space.
We qualify that with every participant in my line of work. This is not something, concentrate on your breathing and your eyes, that alone. Don't take your eyes off the road, okay, and breathe. Okay, so anyhow, if you're driving, don't do this, but if you're sitting down, relaxed, you can come back to it at a time you are. But just imagine for a few minutes you're breathing. Just concentrate on your breathing and just appreciate it for a moment. Take a few deep breaths, and you can fill your lungs as deep as you want. But this is kind of helps you focus your attention to just a couple moments here. And when imagery is typically applied with breathing, guided imagery. But let's also remember there's close parallels with mindfulness and what's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so I can talk about that on a separate note when we get out of this little script. But these are powerful tools to help you focus, concentrate, and you can control this. So I'll just take a few deep breaths here, and then I'll just ask you to imagine a time when you were relaxed and calm, and just think about everything. Think about how you were thinking, your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions at that time, perhaps what you were doing, perhaps where you were. And you want to create that as a vivid detail as you can. And just think about what it feels like to be calm and relaxed and in control. And perhaps add the word confident. Okay. And this can be repeated any time. Really, the number one tool for relaxation on the spot is breathing. I mean, that is the most effective way to bring your blood pressure down and your heart rate down, and just being able to do that unless you have other conditions. So, and where that would be ramped up a little bit, if you will, to focus on motivation is the imagery scripts that we developed in that trial that I talked about addresses two parts of this process for me. The motivational aspect, imagine yourself walking or running at a pace you're comfortable with and you feel in control and confident that you can meet this task. Imagine all the sounds, the sensations, wherever it is. You can be walking 2 miles per hour or running 10 miles per hour. And wherever that is, and just appreciate thinking about that, what it feels like when your body's moving and you're being active. And you are meeting the demands of that situation. So that's heavy on the motivational side. Then on the cognitive side, it could be something like executing proper form, technique in the gym, and imagining, like prompting you, how did your coach teach you how to do the snatch? Okay, how did your coach teach you this technique? Now, visualize that. Visualize it and say those words in your mind. Let's see yourself doing it. Okay, from either a first-person perspective, like you're doing it, or a camera-based perspective, like you're being recorded. So those are two kind of very brief examples of what this might look like. And what we found is that people who use these scripts more are probably going to be achieving their goals more readily than others. That's my general conclusion, but more rigorous research is needed on that topic.
Yeah. There's a lot of great stuff to unpack there. I have two questions. I think the quick one would be the perspective. So you said first person or kind of like a third person, like camera based. Is that personal preference? Would some people tend to respond better to one versus the other, or is it just like comfort?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's pretty more complicated. So a lot of learning takes place by observing others.
Okay.
Right? Observational learning. So if you look at self-efficacy theory and social cognitive theory from Bandura's perspective, that is one way to learn. So you just observe. So it's natural to have that perspective.
Interesting.
Athletes actually prefer that internal perspective more.
Okay.
And more people use the internal perspective. But some athletes and others that I've interviewed over the years have the ability to shift back and forth.
Interesting.
So that's Jack Nicklaus.
Yeah.
That's the Jack Nicklaus, watching yourself play it out, watching that golf ball land on the green.
Yeah.
So it shifts.
Yeah. I was going to say, because I have a hard using the first person perspective, like seeing myself externally, like a camera station at the top of the room, that's easier. I find being first person's actually feels like more work and kind of clunky. So I didn't know if it were more personal preference or if there were differences.
It's generally a preference. Generally your preference. I mean, like a lot of this. I mean, your preference for how much you're going to concentrate on breathing.
Sure.
Comes down to you. You have to decide that. How rigorous are you going to do this?
Yeah.
And then at the end of this, and it's very simple to do, what we encourage our research participants to do is develop their own scripts.
Okay. Yeah.
The only rules of thumb are that you make it vivid, realistic, colorful, emotional, and you include all your senses and emotions.
Okay.
And so people can grasp that readily. And that's a difference with mindfulness. Do you want to talk about mindfulness? Boy, I scratch my head, and this is a big discussion, but that this is more directed. In mindfulness, you're really just observing and accepting what you see, hear, and feel, and exerting control in your daily world where you can, but you're also kind of, you have what's called non-judgmental awareness. And there's more to it than that. There's a lot. It's really, especially I encourage you to look at Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, mindfulness-based stress reduction. It is an evidence-based approach for depression, anxiety, stress, among other conditions. And it has a protocol to it. So where was I going with that?
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, so part of what prompted this discussion, there's this phenomenon in Olympic weightlifting called clarking. So it's basically, you walk up to the bar, you approach it, it's loaded, it's ready for you to, pull it from the ground overhead. And when you grab it, you maybe pull it to your hip and stop. So you stop the movement before you can complete the entire action. And generally that's out of, fear, anxiety, concern that you're going to miss it or you're going to hurt, for various reasons, you might just stop the movement before you even have a chance to attempt it. And someone that I coach, he will have these negative intrusive thoughts, and I won't say the thoughts exactly, but they impact his performance. And maybe, I don't know if he would clark a weight, but maybe he would start missing a little bit more frequently than normal because there are these negative intrusive thoughts that keep him from performing to his potential on a given day. So say someone's in the gym and they're starting to get these intrusive thoughts of, you're going to miss this, you're not even able to, you're not capable of it, whatever they may be, X, Y, and Z. How would this approach help combat against, these negative intrusive thoughts that could be realistic, but likely are more just kind of like noise rather than signal?
Well, that's a fascinating question. This actually takes us in a number of different possible directions, but I've just reminded myself when we met last to discuss this.
Yeah.
I was going to do a plug for a research study.
Oh, sure.
Right in line with this question.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
So first of all, I wouldn't want to be the person that was named after.
Ken Clark. Ken Clark. It was late 80s or...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, it's a phenomenon. Actually, did he discover it?
No, he was the guy who would pull on the bar and not commit to a lift or not go under, and then people started calling it clarking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wouldn't want to be that person.
Yeah.
Oh, poor guy. So, yes, if it's fear-based, that's a little bit of a different story. But
interesting.
I think it's right in line with this approach, but I would go directly to self-talk. And this is what I'm interested in recruiting athletes to interview. And this would be appropriate for weightlifting.
Yeah.
Like weightlifters in particular, we're looking at higher level performers for this right now. So I'm really interested in the interplay between the imagery, which could be intrusive thoughts, or you're seeing yourself clarking, but it could also be the words you're saying to yourself. So that's why I mentioned self-talk. It's very basic. That's explained very well in that Field Manual 22, Army Holistic Health and Wellness Fitness. Where was I going? I keep having these thoughts. Yeah. Fascinating discussion, actually. But I think, I think I'd be interested in talking to people who have that difficulty. And if they use any self-talk strategies, coaching strategies, to really help themselves.
Okay.
And, the idea is that they're not distinct things, but in the research world, they are considered unique.
Right.
There's some work out there, and a study we're trying to get published showed that athletes who have those disruptive images use self-talk and coach themselves. But we didn't bring that out enough. So that's why I'm interested in interviewing individuals who maybe have these challenges or use these tools. And it would be a Zoom interview, probably last 30 to 60 minutes if you're interested. We have West Virginia University institutional approval to conduct this research. So
I'll link your email in the description down below. If people are interested in participating, feel free to reach out to Dr. Giacobbi and maybe in the subject line mention the podcast and your interests.
Yeah, for sure. We'll promote the podcast far and wide.
Well, so the way this would generally play out, I think, and this is how it feels. You maybe take an attempt. So you lift the weight, take an attempt from the floor to overhead, and you're like, wow, that was really heavy. That was really difficult, or it was really rugged. But I need to go up. I need to add weight, or I need to take another attempt. And there's this like, it almost feels like a block of, I know before I even grab the bar, before I even walk up to it, that there's this block on my movement to where I can't access the entire full like lift or like if you want to call like the entire sequence of events to put the weight overhead. I know I'm just going to pull it up halfway and then stop. There's like this weird block. So from using your expertise, maybe you have a thought related to, you can't do this. You don't deserve to do this. You don't deserve to be able to make this weight, or, you're going to injure yourself if you try it. How do you approach helping someone work through that?
Yeah. I think it's what you're describing is a common thing in a lot of sports, especially discrete sports like performing a lift, but it's also very applicable to golf.
Yeah.
Experience these blocks on the golf course, and looking back on all my experience and how this would work in terms of how I would recommend things is you got to do two things. One, you can't get caught in the moment and get distracted. So you don't have time to think about that. You've got to figure out a way, develop the skill, and this is controllable, to just ride the wave and just get the technique done.
Yeah.
And just can't go, you don't step up to a golf ball or a weightlifting or any type of lift with any self-doubt. You've got to have that focus of attention. You just have to be spot on. And so there's a skill to that. I think practicing, perhaps acceptance, just not getting accepted. This is going to happen. You're going to think about this, right? That's the mindfulness side of this.
Yeah.
Okay. I know I've experienced this in the past. I'm good. It's there. This is a real challenge. I'm going to keep stepping up and doing it and addressing it, pressure testing myself, which is part of any performance setting, really. And then the other thing is just telling you, button down those thoughts, get rid of those thoughts, throw them out the door, kick them out the door, whatever, shove them throw them out a window. Imagine those thoughts. Tell yourself, I'm going to throw those thoughts right out the door.
Yeah.
And just coach yourself over and over and over again. Just like physical repetition, you got to have mental reps.
I think that's really helpful because what it feels like is that, what's happening is the only like form of reality that can exist. And what I mean by that is you start having negative thoughts or intrusive thoughts and you're like, oh, this is happening again. And it's going to happen until it stops. Yep. Instead of this, oh, I can intervene or I could change if I have this means of changing my pattern of thinking. So I think when people aren't introduced to this idea of like acceptance commitment therapy, or maybe what you're explaining with guided imagery, it feels like, well, just kind of at the whim of these negative or intrusive thoughts. So I think that's powerful to be able to change that.
Are you at the whim, though? Are you really at the whim of these thoughts and emotions, or are these things that are created in your mind? Part of acceptance is really realizing that I can accept my control. I can accept control and exert control over how I think, feel, and act.
Yeah.
It's just going to take practice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned acceptance commitment therapy. Yeah, that's the essence. You've got to really, a lot of it just starts with acceptance. This is a challenge in the sport. I'm not unique.
Yeah.
There are other people having the same problems.
Yeah.
So the difference is when how and when and why, and you exert control over that. How you practice that in your daily life.
Yeah. So how would someone start? So imagine I listen to the podcast. You've talked about the benefits in many different contexts, and part of the creation of a script and what that would sound like and what it would feel like, but specifically with intrusive thoughts for someone who's in the weight room, on the course, up at bat, whatever it may be, where there is a discrete like action, non-action. What's that like? Let's start on step one of trying to prepare ourselves to like keep those intrusive thoughts from stopping us from our valued action?
Yeah, I think practice.
Okay.
And I think you mentioned stepping up to the plate and hitting a baseball. I've created a guided imagery audio file for my nephew who loves baseball.
Cool.
He's a New York Yankee fan. So any Yankee fans out there, yeah, I grew up in upstate New York. So, and what it involves is just visualizing yourself starting when you're either in the dugout or on the on deck circle.
Okay.
And he described how he actually helped me co-create it.
Okay. Oh, very cool.
And then I just turned it into an audio file, and I did a lot of editorial work on it too. So, and going into the on deck circle, seeing the pitcher, kind of timing his pitches, pretending you're at bat, imagining yourself at bat, and going up there. We were at the time, although his confidence has improved a lot, maybe a little too much. So but he's actually he loves baseball. Wants to work in the industry. I've talked to him about sport management.
Oh, awesome.
So then, one of the scripts we developed, like he was stepping into the plate with low confidence about, I don't remember how we handled that, but by putting yourself in that situation more and more and more and more, either physically and mentally, and going up to the plate, he talked about his grip and what that felt like, what solid contact with the bat and the ball felt like, what the sight and sounds of the ball traveling on the outfield were. And that's a 3-minute script and audio file. And so practicing that over and over again, putting yourself in the situation. And so it's repetition, I think, and coping with that. And then, failing, you're going to fail. Martial arts instructor tells me that all the time. You come and die in the gym, die 100 times in the gym. And that's what we're talking about, practicing.
Yeah.
So, I tell people not to look at guided imagery or imagery as a panacea. It's only one part of the human performance profile, but it can separate people at the very top.
Yeah.
They're using it. So
how would the creation of a script, so a lot of people who listen to this podcast are athletes, are also coaches. And I know they're going to think I should either hire a sports psychologist or performance, like a mental performance coach or something like that, or I can help generate a script for my athletes. So how would you start to advise someone who wants to create a script either for themselves or for an athlete of, we start with, stepping up to the platform, gripping the bar, what it feels like, the sounds, the sights, the process, the outcome, or those like the main areas of focus for a script that's, say, 3 minutes long?
Yeah, including all of the sensory and emotional aspects of that experience. But I can tell you how to do that in 2 words.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence.
Oh, okay.
It will make a script for you, putting me out of business, maybe, I don't know. But you can cut it down to a 3-minute. And then the question is, you can make these yourselves. I've been telling participants, we hope they try, but now they have a tool.
Yeah.
It's really simple.
Yeah.
And so...
so you would use Chat GPT as like a way to, so you'd put in some prompt, guided imagery script for
performance in the gym or performance of a particular skill.
Yeah.
Like, can you write me a 3-minute script for stepping up to the batter's box?
Okay.
In baseball.
Great. Yeah. And I think, as people listening to the podcast who are experts in this, you can take that script and kind of modify it and individualize it and make it exactly what you need to be. But being able to get that outline, I think, would be huge.
Oh, yeah.
Helpful.
Very useful. I just talked to Judith Gordon, the 3rd time I've mentioned her name, collaborator at Arizona. She said, this is where it's going. She's retired, so I'm interested in testing it. Actually, this can happen. But for me, it's also, there's a humanistic element to this. We're all human beings. So you want a machine-generated script? That's okay. But what is the voice you want on the other end of that reading it to you? You want it to be an electronic voice or an actual human voice?
Yeah.
And then I can do it in a teleconsulting role. We can do it here as 2 people, like we did earlier.
Right.
So it's a lot of preferences, and humans thrive when they have choices.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's another part of all the deep philosophical stuff.
Sure.
Go there.
Yeah. Well, I think hearing that, what I think would be powerful for me is you have a script and your coach reads it, and then you kind of hear that, like, the person who's responsible for or helpful for you to reach your performance potential is also help guide you through the process. So it almost feels like this mentor-mentee kind of relationship that'd be really helpful.
That's where it's particularly powerful, I think. And especially on the ground, in the gym, in a performance setting or in a clinical setting, I think, that's where it's most powerful.
Yeah.
Especially if the coach is respected and you enjoy this person, which I know your advisor is a good coach and well-respected coach. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we've covered a lot in terms of applicability, impact, health, and performance. Where do you see, and I know you're one of the foremost people conducting the research, but where do you see this going in terms of what questions are there still to answer?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of them. And I'll just say this is very complex and also very meaningful research, because if we can find simple solutions to help increase people's coping with stress, anxiety, depression, or increase the motivation to go to the gym, or quit smoking, these skills are, I think they fit into a personal responsibility framework, which is talked about a lot. We need to take personal responsibility for the way we think, feel, and act. And our actions are the way we talk to people, the way we interact with people in this world. Taking responsibility is a lost art, in my estimation, or just lost. And so I don't know if that answered that question, but it's one big thing. And I think it's just a simple tool that can have enormous benefits to people who practice it. It has, for those who can do it, I would say mindfulness is also, that we talk about how they're kind of related. Guided imagery is a part of mindfulness.
Yeah.
Yoga, guided imagery and mindfulness are part of yoga. They're also used in the clinical treatment of depression, anxiety, and stress, and other things. Going back to phobias, this is where a lot of this started.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I've spoken with on the podcast, I'm going to blank her name now, but she is kind of an expert on behavior change. I think she did a PhD in some like neuroscience, neurobiology or something. And she would talk about how you would break up a behavior into such discrete parts. When I think generally when people think about behavior change and going to the gym, it's, okay, I need to get to the gym and then I can change, then I can impact my behavior. But she would relate it as, maybe putting your gym clothes out. And that's the first behavior and a step of getting to the gym. It's like, get your gym clothes out, have protein shakes in the fridge, get in your car, get out, don't go anywhere. Okay, get in your car, drive to the gym, don't get out. Get in your car, drive to the gym, get out, go to the door. And I think when you
breaking it down.
Yeah, you break it down and you see it as something that can be impacted on a much different level than, this all or nothing, on or off perspective.
Such a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually just a fascinating question and approach. It gets into modifying the environment.
Oh, totally. Yeah, exactly.
Planning, putting things out. But let's think about the essence of planning. You have to visualize it.
Yeah.
To imagine what you're talking about. That is what it comes down to. I'll take it a step further. It has to be written down.
Okay. Yeah.
Or put on a planner.
It's like brought into the world.
Brought into the world. Yeah. Okay. And then that involves putting Post-it notes on your refrigerator.
Yeah.
Putting your running shoes by the door. All of these things. Protein shake. Yes. And I think that's another thing that, at least I can say this with a lot of students. And as an undergraduate students, they don't understand the importance of planning sometimes.
Right.
Many of them do. I just look around and they pull out a planner and it's color coded. And I'm like, okay, there you go.
Yeah, I got it.
Like sitting right next to me here a couple of weeks ago, and I looked at her planner. Okay, there you go. I mean, she's involved in 100 different things, but that's the essence of it, is visualizing that out, what your week looks like.
Yeah.
When you're going to do laundry,
Yeah. Well,
Go.
Yeah. And part of that flexibility with seeing something that feels all or nothing, but can actually be broken up. I pretty sure, talking to people who are in this space, in the physical therapy realm, with people who experience chronic pain, you can have them visualize movement and have them imagine themselves moving, and doing things that could be perceived as being painful. And it's like, okay, well, that's exposure. And that's great at exposure 101. So I think this idea of like, okay, how do you incorporate this within some sort of behavior change process that can be way more comprehensive than, okay, for physical therapy, you're going to do movement or not do movement. It's like you could just imagine movement happening or occurring that could help grade you into feeling more comfortable, competent, capable.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it from a clinical side for just a second. So along with several doctoral students in our sport and exercise psychology program here,
it's a great program, by the way. If anyone's interested in getting a doctorate in sport and exercise psychology, I'd heavily recommend checking out West Virginia University, specifically Dr. Giacobbi, if research interests align or professional interests align.
Yeah, and the great strength of our program is we also have a counseling master's that goes along with it. Not all students go for that route, but if you can get your PhD at the same time you get your master's in counseling. Very rigorous. I mean, we had, 80 applicants this past year and only took 4, 5.
Okay.
And so it's very rigorous screening selection process. So anyway, let's talk about that from a clinical perspective. So the review, my students and I published what's called the scoping review in a journal called Advances in Preventive Medicine. And we were interested in who is conducting randomized controlled trials using guided imagery and what fields of study they came from. And the top 3 were psychology, sports sciences, and rehabilitation.
Interesting.
So rehab, physical therapy, OT, and it's used in clinics a lot as well to prepare people for surgeries and difficult and, painful procedures, dental procedures as well. So anyhow, from that clinical side, I think it's already being done, right? And what was the second part of your question then?
Oh, I was just thinking about it, framing it from that, like using it as a gradient or a way to ease into movement or managing chronic pain or something.
Yeah,
like
chronic pain, that's a great one. And I should probably have expanded my work into the pain realm a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, at the core of it, exercise should be painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's just remember that. It's not supposed to be easy. It's a warm cup of tea and by the fire. But pain, coping with like back pain and hip pain and joint pain, that's a whole other thing, really. You're trying to get rid of that. And so there's a demand for that, as we've seen with the opioid epidemic over the last generation or so. So I think it comes down to just let's talk about what happens when someone's painful. What do? They become less active.
Yeah, it's an avoidant behavior.
Yeah, they don't want to walk. They don't carry things. Their joints hurt. So then you create secondary health problems over time.
Yeah.
So the key is to do it, first of all, and cope with the pain as best you can.
Right.
I say that as someone who lives relatively pain-free. Except yesterday, little jiu-jitsu was
self-imposed
300-pound guy on my, So anyhow, I think that's really, you have to be sensitive and empathetic towards that. But I think clinicians are in a good place to use mindfulness-based techniques and guided imagery and relaxation techniques in the clinic to do these techniques.
Yeah.
So, as someone at home, you could ask ChatGPT, can you develop me a guided imagery script to cope with pain?
Wow. Yeah. That sounds very powerful.
It will give you something right on the spot.
Yeah.
So you got to be real sensitive to that. And I think when pain is a real thing and there's potential in this space, but we need research and we need funded research.
Yeah.
At a time when research and science and education and public health and public service is being downgraded in a lot of ways, we need this more than ever. This impacts real people, real lives, especially in West Virginia. We have among the highest rates of arthritic conditions. We have an aging population. I mean, they live in rural areas. So we got to provide them with the tools to work through these things and have a quality life. It's an urgent public health challenge, especially when we talk about arthritis.
To your point about personal responsibility, as you develop more of a personal responsibility, that starts to broaden into like a communal responsibility. And, people might say something about, oh, well, everyone's kind of treated equally with respect to you should be able to train and be active and fit. Moving from California to West Virginia, like my steps went from like 13,000 a day, 12 to 15 to 3 to 4. And I find myself craving physical activity. It's just like, where do I go to be active? I can go to the gym again, but it's like, I just want to be out and moving around, walking around, doing things that have me moving my body as opposed to being kind of passive. And, it's a bit of a challenge. And I can imagine if you live farther and farther from the city, it's even more of a challenge. So part of this is recognizing that impact and then being part of the change broadly. And I'd love to get your take on that. But the one last point I would kind of want to bring up before we start to wrap things up is this thing that feels like something I can do once and get a benefit from. As you've kind of commented on, and I've tried to reiterate through the podcast that we've recorded, or the constant effort that comes along with making a decision to be physically active and focused on your health is, and I listened to a great podcast. It's the Barbell Medicine podcast, Austin Brocky and Jordan Fagenbaum, and they talk about who loses weight and who keeps it off. And a lot of that is recognizing that over time, weight loss might not quote unquote stick, and that can be challenging to maintain lower levels of body weight. And there are things that can correlate with that. So, people who don't watch as much TV, people who make certain lifestyle choices, sleep more, et cetera, are more likely to keep weight off. But it's a constant process of working to maintain a change. And the example they use is, if you become strong enough to deadlift 700 pounds and then you stop going to the gym, you're not going to be strong enough to deadlift 700 pounds. You're going to have to train for the rest of your life to maintain that. And I've never thought of it as something
or adopt a active lifestyle.
That's right. So I've never thought of it as something of, this is something I'm going to be aware of for the rest of my life with relation to maybe body composition, body weight, physical fitness. With physical fitness, it makes more intuitive sense. With body composition, you're like, I've gotten down to a certain body weight or I have a certain lifestyle. I can just kind of like relax. But I think always bearing the responsibility of, I'm the person who can make decisions that will lead to maintaining or improvements in, is very powerful. But as you mentioned with the guided imagery, it's probably not going to be something where it's a once off, do it and then I'm done. It's something you're going to practice and improve at and use, when you need it across the lifespan.
Daily.
Yeah. Daily. Right.
Look, two things. You mentioned the bodybuilder, for instance, who gives up weightlifting. What happens to their body? They put on fat.
Yeah. They start to lose muscle mass and they put on body fat.
So humans have choices. We also have modern weight loss medications that work very well.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's not forget that.
There's no stigma. I don't know why there's a stigma with using a weight loss medication, but
well, there shouldn't be, because they are effective.
Yeah.
I will tell you that. I've seen and witnessed people I know, and I've also read some of the science, although I'm not a biochemist.
Sure.
The trials, and then this is why we have research.
Okay? Yeah.
The trials that are conducted with these drugs, modern pharmaceuticals, are revealed they are effective. They are highly effective at helping people lose weight and keep off that weight.
Right.
You have made the choice, however, to take a pill for the rest of your life. Just like weightlifting, right. You can't come off of that pill and expect to keep your body weight low.
Yeah.
Without substantial intervention like caloric restriction and high intensity activity over time, which is another choice. You can do that. And your doctors would probably love it. But the other thing that really struck me about what you said, personal responsibility is one thing, but you mentioned in a community setting, communal support, a whole other project that I'm working on. I interviewed someone about these very issues, the way we think, feel, and act, a couple weeks ago. And he was very highly influenced. He grew up in West Virginia in a small town, highly influenced by his community where he grew up. And that influenced his values, the way he thinks, and his motives. And I think that's a powerful force for human health and human behavior change. Having a community that supports these decisions and helps you and doesn't bring you down, in some way, shape, or form. And in small towns, oftentimes that's the church, or that's the local Walmart, or the coffee shop, or the cafe or diner. So that's pretty striking when you said that. Right away I thought, okay, that's another way to look at this.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think, caveat the podcast, so all these things are for people who want to make a change. If you don't want to make a change, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's an acceptance of, if you recognize and accept potential negative health consequences, and you say, hey, that's great with me, that's perfectly okay.
Yep.
There's no, you don't have to do anything. But if you decide to pursue high performance,
Yep.
if you decide to pursue, changes in certain health outcomes, then it's, hey, there's responsibility, and then there's how are you going to get there, and these are tools to make that more successful or feasible.
I would call them life skills.
Yeah,
They're essentially life skills.
They are life skills because they're kind of transcendent of like one specific thing, right?
Yeah. And they can be applied in your lifestyle. They can be applied in the boardroom. I mean, these are, when you look at high performers, they share a lot of common characteristics.
They do. Yep.
They plan a lot. They have goals. They regulate themselves. They think, feel, and act.
That's right.
It's behavioral regulation. And so I think, yes, if you want to go down the performance domain, what I'd suggest is start applying this in your life in little ways, just your daily life. Like, make a change. A lot of this began when I started focusing really on breathing. A lot of it was in a car when I'm driving. So it's an easy thing to focus on. And then from there, I started using breathing to sleep. But I always used it for golf. But I do it now, like imagine myself go to class. So it's just those little changes in your daily life. Would usually start with goals and maybe some self-awareness, some self-reflection, and then prioritizing, and then figuring out how to establish a routine where you can fit activity, fit imagery, fit relaxation, psychological skills training, weightlifting into your daily routine.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And if people are interested in reading the actual literature, so reading work you've done, where can they go to, one, read your work, but also communicate with you and support you in any way if any of this like resonates with them?
Sure. You can look up my Google Scholar profile. Just look up my last name, Giacobbi. There's a few other Giacobbis, Peter Giacobbi Jr., West Virginia University. You can see my list of publications. Mm-hmm. If you want any of those, I can arrange to get them to you. I can send them to you. Well, I got to be careful, copyright laws. So I can send, you might be able to find them with artificial intelligence. Again, if you do a search with my name, just find this guy's publications and then ask it for sources. Okay. Let's qualify all this. All the students out there, if you're going to use any artificial intelligence, do it ethically and ask it to provide references. Cite your sources. Don't just take it for granted and then go play detective with those sources. So anyway, those are two ways. They can reach out to me directly through you or
yeah. And if you're interested and you want to reach out to me through Instagram at Josh_Phil, WLPHILWL, or Philosophical Weightlifting, you can do that. If you want to email me, philosophicalweightlifting@gmail.com, and I'll redirect you to Dr. Giacobbi. For everyone listening, I hope you enjoy the podcast and you learn something about using guided imagery for health and or performance and or more general life purposes. Any feedback would be incredibly helpful. If you'd like to leave a review for the podcast, 5 stars only, you can do that on any podcasting platform that you're listening to this through. Once again, we appreciate your listen, and we will catch you all next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.